I'm Julie Koppich, and I'm part of the research team. And this work that we're going to present to you is actually the second report that we have done. Dan and I and Julie and many of the people up there, whom I'll describe in a moment, did a first round of LCFF, not evaluation. So this is the second of our reports. The first was quite preliminary. We did it after 6 months of implementation of LCFF, and it was released in October 2014, and it was called Toward a Grand Vision. And in it, we described the enthusiasm for the local control funding formula, a few potential bumps on the road, but basically how happy people were that the world seemed to be changing. And so as David described, we went out and did it again. And we did it again with a slightly different research team. They're listed up here. I'm confident you cannot read their names, but they are from a variety of organizations, from SRI, from AIR. Some of us are independent consultants. Julie's at USC, and one of her students was helpful in this. We had a grad student from Berkeley. We had a whole variety, Inverness Research, we had a whole variety of organizations, and we did that intentionally because we wanted different experiences, skills, and perspectives. And so what we're going to present to you is the not quite completed report. The results won't change. The beauteous report itself won't be out for another couple of weeks. We're still beavering away, putting lovely text to ideas. But each of us is going to take about 7 to 10 minutes-ish and describe to you both findings and recommendations. And so let me, I'm not sure this is another slide yet. I don't think it is. Not yet. Let me start by saying overall that there continues to be a great enthusiasm for moving decisions from the state to local school districts. That people are thrilled that the state finally ended its 40-year reliance on categorical funding, and that it is substituting, in the process of substituting, local decision-making over resource allocation enhanced by parent and community engagement. Let me describe just for a moment what we did so you just get a sense of over the 2 years what kind of work we engaged in. So the set of questions you see is essentially the set of questions we asked for each of the 2 years in the districts we visited, in the county offices we visited, and generally with the people we interviewed. So we asked about how they used resources, what kinds of engagement strategies they used, in what ways were they changing student strategies, what kind of capacity challenges did they run in, and if they could have the State Board of Ed sitting right here, what is it they would say to them? What would they suggest be changed? And over the next 2 slides just kind of give you a bunch of numbers to dazzle you. Over 2 years, we conducted 216 interviews in 19 school districts. We reviewed 85 LCAPs, a task no one should have to do. We interviewed staff in 36 county offices of education, 36 of the state's 58, and those 36 county offices serve 701 school districts. And we talked with a variety of state officials as we went along, just to kind of test ideas, test what we were finding. So what is it that we found? Continuing enthusiasm and nagging concerns. The 2 quotes on this slide are kind of the opposite ends. One says, we really like this idea. Our community gets to engage in deciding how our students should learn, what they should be doing, how we should spend the money. And the other opposite end is, I've been worried all along that the small L, that the local was going to be the small L, and control was going to be the big C. They were both from district officials, by the way, in not very different school districts, but those were their perspectives. Despite the fact that there are some nagging concerns, which I'll briefly describe to you, everybody we talked to said, give it more time. You know, it's too new to make big changes. Please, state, don't make big changes. Not yet. Give it some time to work. There's some things that probably could be fixed, some mid-course corrections that need to be made, but don't make big changes. But the kinds of concerns that they had were, well, one is that it's really hard to change minds. And categorical funding is deeply embedded in the DNA of California educators, deeply embedded. So shifting people out of the mindset of categorical thinking is very tough. The Great Recession of 2008 is not a distant memory yet. People remember it very well. They're very frightened by it. They're concerned that the money will go away. It seems to be there now, but what happens when it isn't? And therefore we found things like districts hiring consultants instead of permanent staff, out of fear, in fact, that they wouldn't have money to keep those staff. And there is just a tad bit of concern about the pending rubrics. We got asked a lot of questions about the rubrics, none of which we could answer, of course. But people are worried about them. They've heard about them. They saw the first version. They know the first version was yanked back. They know there's another version being produced, but they don't know what they're going to be. And while the state keeps assuring districts that, in fact, these aren't going to be punitive, it's to help you grow, a little bit of skepticism there on the part of districts. While we talked to nobody, literally nobody in all these interviews who said they wanted to go back to categorical funding, there is some growing angst about what many districts see as the law's kind of creeping bureaucratic requirements. So for example, we didn't hear any groundswell of protest around the state's 8 determined priorities. People kind of were coping with them. They were okay. They weren't arguing against them. But there was this lingering question we got from people about how respectful 8 state-mandated priorities are of the notion of local control. We turn now to the LCAP. And the increasing tension between local and control, I think, plays out most starkly in examining LCAPs. So these are the nicest words that we could come up with from our interviews that people used to describe the LCAP. Unwieldy, a nuisance, self-defeating, a beast of a document, doesn't allow us to tell our story. We heard that last time too. And then there's this kind of plaintive quote at the bottom from a district administrator who said, you know, what we really want to do is engage our parents. We want this to be what we think it is supposed to be. But in fact, the LCAP template does not allow us to do that. So what are the problems that we found with the LCAP? 5 challenges. Insufficient clarity about purpose, confusion about what funds go into the LCAP, the endless cycle, a compliance orientation, and a lack of transparency and accessibility. Just a word about each of those. People don't know what the LCAP's for. What is it meant to be? Is this meant to be a strategic planning document, or is it meant to be a compliance document? Is it meant to be a budget? Is it meant to be something to display to parents, what the district's doing? Is it meant to be something else entirely? Secondly, confusion about funds. Districts do not know what funds are to be included in their LCAP. So we have one study district that distinguishes specifically between the LCFF and the LCAP program. The LCAP program in this district is only supplemental funds. That's it. They believe that's what they're meant to do. Other districts have different arrays of funds included, but nobody's really clear on what's supposed to be there. Third is what we're calling the endless cycle. The way it's set up now, districts are to do a 3-year plan with an annual update. But it doesn't really work out that way. In fact, what happens is that each subsequent year's plan is a lot of cutting and pasting of the previous year's plan. There really isn't much of an annual update, not much time for districts to reflect on, here's how we spent our money, here are the results we got, here's what we want to change, here's what we want to do differently. They essentially redo the document all over again each year. And one person described it to us as always being in LCAP mode. Compliance orientation is a real dilemma. County offices, as you know, approve the LCAP, and for many districts, the county office approval has resulted in dotting I's and crossing T's. There's not much technical assistance. And the LCAP is not on the same timeline as the myriad other state and federal reports that districts have to submit, often with the same information. So as we heard, if it looks like a compliance document and walks like a compliance document, it's a compliance document. And the fifth is lack of transparency and accessibility. Parents can't read an LCAP. Nobody could read an LCAP. There's no executive summary. There's no way that people can sort through and say, here's what we as a district are doing as a result of engagement with you and others. We had one district administrator tell us that he had to provide Cliff's notes to his own principals because they couldn't figure out what the LCAP said. And as he said, it doesn't inform many people because really nobody wants to read it. So on that happy note, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
So we also spent a lot of time trying to understand the community engagement piece of this policy, and spent a lot of time last year and this year trying to understand it. And then the first thing that we saw was that there was strong efforts by districts to really engage a wide range of stakeholders in this process. We saw commonly across the districts representative advisory groups, the use of surveys, community-wide meetings. There were great efforts put to making sure that there were translators, that they were scheduled meetings at the right times and in different locations, that there was childcare, that there was information provided on the web and in print. So very strong efforts to engage the community, but unfortunately very low levels of turnout and low response rates on those surveys, and particularly a decrease in the second year. And for some districts that was intentional. So some districts really did, in part based on some of what Julie was saying, was this sort of uncertainty about the cycle, whether they really needed to do a sort of wholesale revamping of their engagement that they had done in the first year, whether this was just an update and it was okay to kind of ramp down a bit in their engagement process. But what we did see was an increase in what we're calling sort of interest-based, interest group advocacy kinds of efforts. In some of the districts that we were in, we saw factions developing in the community, in some cases 20 different parent groups arguing for their various positions. We saw some unorganized groups all of a sudden becoming a bit more organized in the second year. And a lot of talk around, it's not a lot, but in a lot of places we would hear something about sort of the loudest voices playing a big role in shaping the LCAP and in what was coming out. And an example in a couple of our districts, we had parents for advocating or representing their more advanced and gifted kids who were successful in gaining greater opportunities for their kids in terms of increasing the number of AP courses, for example. And there was also a part of the unions, right? They're supposed to be playing a part in this. And there was discussions in several of the districts around putting more of the LCFF dollars on the table for bargaining and for salary increases. And in some cases, we saw very collaborative relationships between the union and the district in terms of making these decisions around how to allocate LCFF funds. And in other places, they were quite contentious. And so all of that kind of interest-based, or what we're calling sort of adversarial kinds of interactions that we were observing really shows up in the LCAP document. And so in the LCAP document, you see a lot of sort of pushing for investments in programs that will satisfy particular needs, but not necessarily a focus on sort of a coherent set of strategies or a push on sort of advancing the common collective good of a community. And we weren't really seeing that. Or pushing for equity across schools with an understanding that maybe equity doesn't necessarily mean equal. And we were kind of seeing that across our cases. Now, in theory, the school board members could be playing a role in sort of mediating the interest-based or the sort of adversarial kinds of interactions I've described. But by and large, in most of our districts, we weren't seeing school board members very active in this process. In some cases, we heard people questioning their level of understanding of this process and also their motives. One case, for example, there was a deep feeling that the school board was there to protect the status quo. And then one final thing that sort of complicates this picture is really the lack of public awareness about LCFF. So David and I and others at PACE and USC did a poll over the summer of California registered voters, and 65% of them had never heard of or read about LCFF. And that was actually an increase from the year before. Our poll showed that 45% of folks hadn't heard about it. So you can imagine that the districts are doing a lot in terms of trying to promote, and I should say that those numbers are slightly greater for parents who have been involved, either that they vote in their school board elections or they're in the PTA. But still, those numbers are pretty low in terms of their awareness of this policy. So you can imagine how difficult it has been for some of these districts that are trying very hard to try and publicize opportunities for community engagement, but they're sort of facing an uphill battle when there's really just very little awareness of the policy in general. Given sort of the transformation that LCFF is really calling for in terms of district planning and resource allocation, it's not surprising that there were a lot of implementation and capacity challenges that we came across, and these are just sort of highlighting some of them. The first is just the issue that we all know, which is in California, how difficult it is to develop policies when we have such tremendous variation in the kinds of districts and counties that we have, right? So we have some districts, 43% are serving fewer than 1,000 students. We have other districts, right, that are serving 50, 100,000 kids. Counties that are serving, maybe 8, 10, whatever, 1. So we have such a range in terms of the size, and we heard over and over that in those smaller districts, for example, there wasn't the expertise or the staff to do a lot of these things in terms of tracking data, coming up with the metrics, doing the community engagement pieces. Another sort of example of the variation is on wealth. We know that 10% of districts are basic aid districts who get little to no supplemental or concentration funds. And given sort of the confusion around the purpose that Julie had talked about, some of these basic aid districts really don't think that LCFF really applies. They should have to do an LCAP. Big cultural shifts, right? I think Julie alluded to this too. I mean, that LCFF is really calling on big shifts for a lot of county and district administrators whose careers have been spent working with sort of compliance requirements from state and federal governments. And so we're seeing that this sort of shift to LCFF, that mindset shift, is going to take some time. And another challenging mindset shift is really one that pertains more to the advocacy groups, who I think, and we've been seeing that there's sort of a tendency for these groups who are used to sort of pushing districts, criticizing districts in a more adversarial role, but under LCFF are really being asked to be more of a partner. And that's been a difficult shift. Local context. In a few of our cases, there was a history of friction and a lack of trust between community groups and the district, and that definitely challenged the implementation of all of this. We did see in some cases some of the community organizations are building new skills on how to organize parents and how to hold the district accountable. But again, it's going to take some time for the community groups to sort of build up their potential and their full capacity to be partners. And there's this history that is definitely in the background shaping how this is playing out. County offices clearly playing a huge role as a mediator of this entire process. And the county offices are also quite limited in what they can do. And we heard over and over again from the county offices that they had, the amount of time that this is taking and the limited expertise and staff that they have, and fears about what happens when state money goes away and when their responsibilities increase, when the rubric, as Julie said, comes out. Some real concerns there about how they're going to continue doing this work. And we heard a lot from the districts that they were getting helpful advice from the county offices in terms of how to fill out the LCAP and how to answer basic questions. But we weren't really seeing substantive technical assistance and advice that was being given by the county offices. And I think a lot of the county offices really wanted to play more of that sort of coaching role rather than being sort of the LCOP, as we heard in one of our counties, but they just didn't have the capacity to do so. And I think another thing that I wanted to say was that given sort of the ambiguity of the policy and the different levels of expertise in these county offices, we were seeing very different interpretations and guidance being given to districts. So in one of our districts that had a high unduplicated count, they were told that none of their supplemental and concentration funds could go to any kinds of activities that would benefit all students. And yet in other districts, the county was telling them that that was okay. And very big differences in terms of what the advice they were being given on what should be included in the LCAP, what funds. Should it be the base funds or just the supplemental and concentration funds? So again, the county is playing such an important role here that we really need to kind of stay on top of that. Two last things. Looming teacher shortage. A lot of folks were saying that one of the biggest challenges to the successful implementation of this over time is this teaching shortage that's looming. So a few of our districts didn't have enough teachers this year to fill all the positions that they had. But most of the districts were more concerned about in the future years. So we had one district that was using LCFF funds to lower class size and was very concerned whether they would have enough qualified teachers to sort of fill those new classrooms. And so that, again, was a big concern. And then also substitute teachers was a big concern in some of the districts, and how they were going to then do the professional development that they were purchasing with the LCFF funds when they didn't have enough substitutes. And then finally, all of these challenges, to really address them, requires, at all levels of the education system, a really sort of efficient and effective systems. And there's a feeling that, in some ways, LCFF and the LCAP isn't promoting capacity building at the district level. Really important things like having data systems and a high-functioning HR group of folks, or professional development for personnel. And so I think some people were hoping that California Collaborative for Education Excellence, CCEE, would be providing some of that support in the future and capacity building. I think they're hoping that the CCEE will be able to broker support for districts and also provide exemplars of practice. I think there was a huge need. We heard over and over people wanting to see best practices and examples. But there's still a looming concern that maybe CCEE will also turn more into sort of a compliance-oriented organization and not able to support the sort of capacity building that's needed out there. With that, I'm going to pass it on to Dan and talk about sort of our thoughts for the future.
So it just dawned on me, why did I volunteer to do the contentious part of this presentation? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what are really draft recommendations and implications of what you just heard. So we are still trying to refine these, so don't hold us to them. Okay, so starting with the state, and I think to a large extent, a lot of the action, particularly when we're in Sacramento, tends to be focused on the state. But I would say that our recommendations are really for all levels of the system, and a lot of the things that we say about the state policy actually applies to the other levels as well. So the first one is really about reaffirming the purpose. We have, as Julie have explained, this is a big cultural shift, and the whole compliance mentality and the sort of steady diet of compliance and no child left behind is really a challenge for educators in California to get over. And because of those habits, really it sort of pushes the locus of control back to the state level, and that's not that's not intentional, but it's just sort of how the process works. So because of issues like low public awareness, we think it would be a really good idea, especially for the governor and also for the state board, to use the bully pulpit to sort of reaffirm what this is all about. The next one has to do with the LCAP, and to a person, we heard everybody say they hated it, and everybody also said, but don't change it, as Julie indicated. And we really had to grapple with that, because we firmly believe that the LCAP has the potential to undermine the whole initiative, the whole idea behind it. And so doing nothing is just not really a solution. However, we've got certain political realities and certain timeline realities, and so it's going to be very difficult to sort of throw it out and start over. So what we're suggesting instead, at least for this coming round, is that we don't make any big changes, but we do make changes that we can that will simplify it, that will make it more workable and just reduce the burden. Now, we know that there are some efforts out there. We know that there's going to be a rollout of an electronic template that's supposed to make it easier, which makes me shudder, but we'll see. And there's certainly a lot of discussion about what we ought to do and what needs to happen. The next thing, though, is really that it's time to start now thinking about how we're going to change it, and don't wait another year before you start dealing with that. We've got to refine, be clear about the purpose, and then really simplify the thing. It's really getting in the way. One thing that was interesting when we talked to district officials, it was often that they were waiting around for the state to tell them what to do. And we found that both in terms of county offices and also in terms of districts, that they're not taking full advantage of the leeway that they actually have. So for example, there's nothing to stop districts from building an executive summary into their LCAP. They could do that. But because it's not mandated, they're not. And so it's that kind of change of thinking that we think is really, really important. The other part of that is really about promising practices. Districts were very hungry to find out how others were doing things, and there really isn't a good vehicle for doing that. County offices could do more. Identifying promising practices, CDE could do more, CCEE could do more, but right now it's sort of informal, and people are hearing rumors about some practice here and some practice there. But we need really a repository of how to do this well. That would be particularly helpful around the stakeholder engagement piece. As Julie Marsh noted, that's probably one of the weakest links in all of this. It's very difficult work to really do little d democracy, and districts don't have the expertise to actually do this. And so looking for help from outside groups to try and promote these very educative and deliberate kinds of conversations about the common good is something that it's a hard policy recommendation, but I think it's really important that we try and get the public engagement piece right. And finally, this looming problems, big picture problems. One thing that we can't walk away from in all of this is that recognizing the adequacy problem. We still are not funding our schools at a level that is adequate. And that results in sort of core capacity issues for districts. If in an era of teacher shortages, if you've got a weak HR department, you're in real trouble because you're competing with strong HR departments next door. And that's just one thing. Data systems, buildings, everything. You've got to have those core capacities. And so building those capacities, getting help from county offices and from the state. But really, we've got to talk about adequacy in terms of resources. And finally, on this one, I was on a study in 2000, 1999, 2000, 2001, on California and the status of the teaching profession. And we have a report about the impact of having a statewide average of 15% of the teachers being on emergency credentials. And the impact of that was devastating to the state. I think we're still trying to catch up from all of that. In addition, we know that when you have teacher shortages, they're concentrated in the wrong places. They are always in the schools and the districts that serve the poor kids and the English language learners. And so as we are trying to use LCFF to close those achievement gaps, we're going to be totally undermined if we go back to 2000 and experience that level of teacher shortages. And frankly, we're not seeing sort of the urgency of this matter in state policy and in local actions yet. County offices. As I said before, a lot of these things apply to county offices. You know, bully pulpit is one of them, for example. Specifically, we've got to help the county office staff who actually do the legwork of looking at LCAPs, help them get over their decades and decades of compliance mentality. That's been their job. And I remember talking to an ed services person who was telling me, you know, I've never done anything like this before in my life, and this is really new for me. So the tendency to go to compliance is sort of a natural one. We talked about the different messages that the county offices are sending to districts, and we saw a lot of variation there. And there's a lot of capacity variation in county offices, from a superintendent and an admin to very large offices that serve 80 some odd districts. So, but getting the county offices and giving them help in being clear about the purpose and goals of the LCFF and communicating that to their districts is really, really important. And then also calibrating the approval process. Right now, you can get approved for one thing in one place and not approved for it someplace else. And so I know that the CSESA has been working on this. There's a lot more to do. And for the districts, you know, it's also about compliance mentality and how do you move from there. Superintendents need to use the bully pulpit to try and move people to this new world. We talk a lot about, and we'll talk a lot about in the report, about the community engagement piece, and this is hard, as Julie pointed out. But it really is a problem of the loudest voices. When you see the main thrust of an LCAP being the addition of AP courses, you really have to wonder whether or not that's consistent with the goal of the LCFF. So developing deliberative and educative conversations about the common good and using data to help educate and help people understand what the problem is. I did a little study on foster, Julie and I did a little study on foster youth last year, and you know, I didn't know anything about foster youth, and I went out and found out some alarming statistics about this group of kids. And my argument is that if parents and community members understood the actual needs of that group and the other groups that we're talking about, and the real outcomes of those groups, that they could get over their urgency of the addition of more AP classes. Not that that's a bad thing, but how do we get those kids in those AP classes would be the question. We talked about engaging the school board and the need to do that. I think there are statewide groups that are trying to do some work on that. I think it needs to be accelerated. And really, I think it's important that we start trying to figure out ways of using sort of representative advisory groups with very structured protocols for how do we define the problems here. It's, as Julie said this morning to me, it's really about needs over wants. And I think that's a good way to think about it. So finally, you know, last year we were standing here and we were saying, you know, a lot of enthusiasm and some concerns. And now we're here to say there's a real urgency here. We're going to lose this if we don't get it right. This is a quote that we had from the superintendent last year. This governor and this state board of education did something that has never been done in the United States without a court case. It changed the distribution mechanism from an equality formula to an equity formula. And I think that unto itself is noteworthy, stunning, and amazing. And I still think that that's right. But we are here to tell you that we're going to lose this opportunity unless we do some pretty urgent fixes.